Thank you for coming back with us, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is coming to us from the UK. David A. Jones is the director of the Anscombe Centre at Oxford, and he has degrees from both Cambridge University and Oxford University in philosophy and in theology. He is a previous director of the Linacre Centre for Healthcare Ethics, whom many of you who've been involved with healthcare ethics for a while will remember that name, and that is what has become the Anscombe Centre now that it's based at Oxford. And so David's talk is entitled "The Theology Relating to Donor Insemination in the Roman Catholic Church." So thank you very much, David.
Thank you. I think I will try to speak slowly because I'm not quite sure of the technology, but I can see you at least, so can people nod if they can hear me? Yes, good, right, I'll take that you can. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about the theology of donor insemination from a Roman Catholic perspective. So this is looking perhaps at just one specific Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, and also looking at one specific technology, assisted reproductive technology, and that's donor insemination. And this is useful perhaps because donor insemination is one of the oldest of the reproductive technologies, but also perhaps it has something in common with the question of artificial gametes. And that's because we're asking, where have these gametes come from? So perhaps there's a similarity. So there's a usefulness in looking at donor insemination, even though in a way it's quite an old question. A place to start in looking at Catholic understandings of reproductive technologies in general is the document Donum Vitae. Donum Vitae was a Vatican document from 1987, and it looked at a whole range of reproductive technologies. And so though there was teaching before that and has been teaching since, Donum Vitae remains a very useful place to go for summing up the tradition. And according to Donum Vitae, there are basically just two fundamental moral principles, two fundamental values that need to be considered in thinking about reproductive technologies. The first is the value of the human being who is called into existence, the inviolability of human life. And that's a hugely important principle. Obviously, we think of it in relation to abortion, but it also is relevant to reproductive technologies. And the second principle, they said, is the special nature of the transmission of human life in marriage. And I'll come back to that, but that's how it's phrased. So, as it were, one value is to do with the child who is produced, the value of the life of the individual. The other is the value of the transmission of that life. So it's not about the life itself which is produced, but about the dignity of the transmission of life, not just about the dignity of the life that is transmitted. In a way, I think that the value of the life itself is more obvious to us, not only because of the debate over abortion, but just in general. I think that we have, there's a very widespread agreement, very widespread realization that every human being is a creature of value. People who have very different views about ethics, people have very different presuppositions, they recognize that if anything is valuable, there's something valuable in the human being. And even if sometimes it might be justified to kill a human being, you need a pretty good justification. And I don't think there's anybody who thinks that you can just kill human beings without some kind of justification. So there's the sense of the value of individual human beings is very widely shared. This is relevant to assisted reproductive technologies because in vitro fertilization actually is very harmful to human life in its earliest stages. It's very harmful to human embryos. So if you think that the value of human life starts with fertilization, if you think that human embryos are human beings in an embryonic stage, then in vitro fertilization has ethical questions because of the experimenting on embryos, because of discarding embryos, because of selecting embryos, because of screening out embryos which don't cut the mustard, as it were, those that don't have the qualities that we're looking for in the embryo. So there are questions about the value of human life when we talk about in vitro fertilization. But actually the older technology, the technology of artificial insemination, doesn't pose any harm to embryos, to early human life, at least not any physical harm. It's basically quite a crude technology, just physically, artificially introducing sperm. So the fertilization takes place in the womb. There's no harm to the embryo. So that if the only thing at stake was the physical integrity, the inviolability of human life, then there would be nothing wrong with donor insemination. If the only value was the value of the life which was created. But from the very beginning, Catholic theologians in the early 20th century, as soon as they came across this technology, they were strongly opposed to it. And they were opposed to it not because of the threat that they thought it posed, physical threats to the human life, but because of the threat they thought it posed to the dignity of the transmission of that life. And in particular, the idea that life should be transmitted, human life should be transmitted by the human institution of marriage. That it is only the spouses who have the duty, who have the right to have children by one another. So this is a quotation from Pope Pius XII in 1949. It is the spouses alone who have mutual rights over their bodies for generating new life. And this right is exclusive, non-transferable, and inalienable. So here what's inalienable is not the value of the life of the person, it's the right that the spouses have, the husband and wife have, to be the exclusive partner for having children. So if I get married, I say I will be the father to your children, and my wife says I will be the mother to your children. That's part of what marriage is, and that if we introduce a third party to that, we're contradicting this the rights of the husband and wife to be the exclusive partners for the generating of children. And not only that, but we're also creating a barrier in a way, or we're undermining the link between particularly the father, the legal and social father, and the child who is not his physical child, he's not his biological child. So we're endangering the relationship of father and child, and we're undermining the relationship of husband and wife. And this was a view that the Catholic Church had right from the outset, as shown by Pius XII. It was also a view which was held by many other Christian denominations at that time, and it's a view which was expressed very clearly by the Archbishop of Canterbury, also in 1949, in the House of Lords, where he said very clearly, in fact, that artificial insemination is a form of adultery. It's not exactly the same as adultery in the ordinary sense. It doesn't involve that kind of betrayal, but it is still an introduction of a third party to the bond of marriage, and as such, it's an intrusion into marriage and a violation of the sacred bond between husband and wife. So this is a view of the Catholic Church, but also of other denominations at the time. I think this is well and good, but it's not obvious that this has much to do with theology. You say, well, husbands, wives, that's about marriage, children from marriage, you might think it's about rights, but is it really about theology? And I think it was a fair criticism of some, or perhaps much, Catholic moral theology in the 1950s, that it actually wasn't very theological. That a lot of it was quite technical. It was about rights and duties. It was about virtues. It was about cases and authorities. But it wasn't. There wasn't very much explicit theology. The theology was in the background. And in the 1960s, in the Catholic Church, when we had the Second Vatican Council, one of the things the Second Vatican Council wanted to do was renew theology, renew all branches of theology by being more explicitly scriptural, more explicitly turning to the fathers, more explicitly theological in reasoning. So the reasoning wasn't just natural philosophy, it wasn't just moral philosophy, but it was distinctively theology. I think not all moral theologians have been equally theological. Some, I think, moral theologians are still philosophers in disguise. But there are certainly some Catholic theologians who are very theological. And one of those was Pope John Paul II. And if you read the writings of Pope John Paul II, they're full of scripture. And the scripture is not just there for proof text, it does work. I mean, there's a lot of profound reflection on scripture and theological themes in John Paul II. And the document Donum Vitae is strongly influenced by Pope John Paul II. So when it talks about marriage and about the transmission of life, the document doesn't just talk about the natural rights of parents or the rights of a child. It talks about theology. It talks about God. And I'll give you a quotation. The procreation of a new person, whereby the man and the woman collaborate with the power of the Creator, must be the fruit and sign of the mutual self-giving of the spouses, of their love and fidelity. So this is a quotation from Donum Vitae, and it starts with the fact that we are all created by God, that there's something which is deeply mysterious about the creation of a new life. The creation of a new human life is a special creation by God. And the collaboration of the parents in the bringing about of new life is therefore a special kind of collaboration with God. It's a theological moment. And then also, so the document talks about a self-giving in marriage, and a self-giving which shows itself in the new life of the child. And this also is theological language. In the footnote, it refers to the book of Genesis, and a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. So we go back to the two becoming one flesh of Genesis. But I think it isn't just about going back to Genesis and the theology of creation. It's also about the theology of covenant, the covenant between God and Israel, which is an image of God being married to Israel. Marriage becomes an image of the relationship of God and the people. And this is perfected in the image of Christ and the church. So St. Paul in the letter to the Ephesians says, this is the mystery. When he talks about the quotation from Genesis, the two become one flesh, he says, this is the mystery. And the mystery of the two becoming one flesh, of the man and the woman, is actually a mystery of the relationship of Christ and the church. So the understanding of marriage has changed. And it's changed because of marriage now becoming a sign of a covenant relationship between God and the church, between Christ and the church, which is a different, raises up marriage to be a different kind of reality. And not only that, but later on in another document, Dignitas Personae is a recent document, this thought is extended to include not just Christ and the church, but also the Trinity. So the document says, the act which permits a new human being to come into existence, in which a man and a woman give themselves to each other, are a reflection of Trinitarian love. so that the love of the man and the woman, giving rise to new life of a child, is an image of the love and the unity of the Trinity. Not, of course, that the persons of the Trinity are married to one another. That would take us into a strange theology. But that the Trinity are united in love, and it's that unity of love which is the final end of human life. But also that, in particular, that marriage is an image of Trinitarian love. And therefore that the child should be the fruit of love, a fruit of the bond between the man and the woman, is also something which now has a new theological significance. So there is then at the same time, both a natural account of the good of marriage, a natural account of the duties of husband and wife, the good of the child to know its parents and to be brought up in a stable environment and so on. There's a natural account of marriage. But at the same time, there's a theological account of marriage. And that theological account of marriage is doing real work. At least in these Vatican documents, it is doing work. So that when we think of marriage not just as a strong bond, but an indissoluble one, when we think of any kind of intrusion into this as being something which must be a kind of betrayal, this has as part of the background the indissoluble bond, the indissoluble fidelity of God to the covenant, as it were. So we're seeing the two becoming one flesh, not only in a natural way, but also for what it is an image of supernaturally. And I think this is important because when we come to how well this teaching is accepted both within the church and within the wider society, then of course not everybody accepts this theological account of marriage. And indeed, even within the Catholic Church, in its own, the Catholic Church has a very sophisticated, very subtle account of marriage, which it has to have because marriage as an institution is also a legal institution. So you have to say all the time, are these people married or not? And so there are accounts of what are the impediments to marriage? What do you need in order to be married? Are people still really married? Are people ever allowed to get separated? Are people ever allowed to get divorced? And so on. There is a canon law, a church law of marriage. And within the Catholic Church's law of marriage, which is developed over centuries, there is actually an account of at least two different kinds of marriage. There is an account of what's sometimes called natural marriage, which is a marriage between two unbaptized people, or one baptized and one unbaptized person. And that's a natural good, and that there are certain things which are true of it, and the church has an account of what natural marriage is. But the church also has an account of what it calls sacramental marriage, where where the husband and wife are both baptized, and where, because of their baptism, the marriage represents Christ and the church in a stronger sense than it does for people who don't know anything about the church. So when Christians who are baptized marry one another, because of their baptism, their marriage doesn't just image the church, but it actually becomes a participation. Because they are Christians, they are part of the church, and they do share in Christ's life. So that the bond between husband and wife actually becomes a participation in this bond between Christ and the church. And you have, according to the Catholic understanding, a different kind of marriage, a sacramental marriage. And the church has to have accounts not just of whether Catholics who marry Catholics are married, but also of all kinds of other marriages, because Catholics marry other people. So you've got to know, are these people who they marry already married or not? So the church actually has lots to say about the marriages of baptized people who are not Catholic, the marriage of non-baptized people, and so on. And it has a slightly different account of marriage of natural marriage to sacramental marriage, including, and perhaps this is controversial, that for good reason, if one of the parties is innocent, it is possible for the Pope to dissolve a natural marriage. So the Church recognizes a kind of divorce in the full sense that you had a marriage, you don't have one afterwards, it is dissolved, and the person can then marry a Christian, if the previous marriage was natural. Whereas the Pope doesn't think that he has any authority to do so with sacramental marriage, because he thinks that this is absolutely indissoluble and can't be dissolved by any human authority. So within the Church's teaching, interestingly, there's a slight difference, it's only slight, but there is a slight difference between its account of natural marriage and its account of sacramental marriage. But I think, so that's one question about whether even in the Church's understanding, natural marriage and sacramental marriage are the same. But more of a problem for the Church in putting this view forward is that an awful lot of people don't have the same understanding of natural marriage. That even if there could be an understanding of natural marriage, which was open to natural reason, to philosophy to understand, people have had different understandings of marriage in the past. And this is obvious even from the Old Testament. That in the Old Testament you have polygamy. That in the Old Testament you have divorce. So if the idea of marriage is that it should be completely exclusive and not involve a concubine and not involve a second wife and not involve divorce, then even Moses didn't realize this. David didn't realize this. Solomon didn't realize this. So it's not obvious. Even if it is true and it's something which the human mind can come to, it's not a truth which was obvious even to the saints of the Old Testament. And indeed, and this is relevant to donor insemination, if we think that donor insemination is problematic because of marriage, because of that marriage is the measure of whether something is an intrusion or not. And I'll just give an example of how things might get complicated. In Genesis chapter 30, Jacob marries Rachel, but Rachel can't have children, which doesn't seem to be able to have children, and is frustrated by this. So she said to her husband, quote, "Here is my maid, Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, and even I may have children through her." I mean, I'm not quite sure what is meant by bearing on my knees. I'm not sure if when she actually gave birth, she actually had to sit on Rachel's knees in order that the child should come out from between the knees. But certainly you have here in the Old Testament a wish to have children, a wish to acknowledge marriage, but still, when this is frustrated, an acceptance of bringing in a third party, of bringing in the maid. Now, I don't think this is. I'm not arguing that this is acceptable, or that the scriptures give a reason for it being acceptable. I'm saying that if even within these stories people were not so clear that when you couldn't have children of your own, then there wasn't some way to extend this marriage somehow. If people even in the Old Testament weren't clear, then we shouldn't expect. I mean, well, perhaps we should expect, but it's not surprising that people in our society also say, well, obviously, if you can have children from husband and wife, then you should. But if you can't, well, maybe we should have some other kind of marriage. This, incidentally, is made explicit within Islam, where people have temporary marriages, temporary second marriages of a second woman in order to allow donor gametes, the use of donor gametes. So there are sometimes, even in the modern context, people trying to extend in this way what might be acceptable. This isn't acceptable from a Catholic perspective, not only because it's not compatible with a Christian view of what Christian marriage is, but it's not compatible with a modern Catholic understanding of what natural marriage is. But the problem, I think, is that the understanding of what marriage is, people are loosening their grip on. And this has, of course, become more difficult because of contraception, because people are now used to thinking that sex need not have anything to do with children, and so sex need not have anything to do with marriage. And the link between sexual union, marriage, and children, that the understanding of sexual union was to do with marriage, and the understanding of children, which was to do with marriage, that is starting to break down, because people think it's a nice context to have sex, maybe, but it's not the only possible ethical context in which people can have sex. Certainly in secular society, that's the case, and maybe it's not the only context in which to have children. So the idea of someone who is not married by donor insemination having a child but not in marriage is now more socially acceptable, because that link between marriage, the union of the spouses, and children isn't so strong, because the notion of natural marriage isn't so strong. And this was already the case because of contraception and because of easy access to divorce. Even before we started thinking about whether two people of the same sex, their relationship might be called a marital relationship, where we might have a married institution, public institution of marriage for people of the same sex. That, I think, takes it even further. I think it is a step change, and it is not just the same as the problems of divorce or other kind of problems. But I think that it's even thinkable in a modern context. I can understand why people defend it, because I think there has already been a weakening of the understanding of marriage. And certainly the understanding of marriage which exists in wider society is already quite a long way from the understanding of marriage as reflected in the book of Genesis, particularly as informed by the teaching of Jesus. And I think this makes it more difficult for people to say, well, okay, it might be a nice thing if the husband and wife, the child is the fruit of the husband and wife, but if that's not practical, why can't we have some other kind of practical arrangements? And it's boiled down to a kind of practicality. The notion that marriage is an intrinsic particular kind of thing, a particular kind of institution, which makes sense of the love of men and women, which makes sense of the transmission of life, that has been, I think, severely weakened already. And if we do have, as already is the case in some countries, if we do have homosexual marriage, I think it will be weakened further. This is a problem even for donor insemination, which is still natural in the sense of it's a man's sperm, it's a woman's egg, it's just, as it were, not the man she's married to, but that's not so new. And we see that even perhaps with the Bilhart example. I think when you get to artificial gametes, when you get to a new range of questions we haven't even started, the problem is that we haven't actually got a good foundation to build on. That if we can't even get right perhaps the most obvious kind of tension with marriage, which is when you have another person whose gametes are being used, if we can't even get that clear in our mind, how actually are we going to take forward much more complicated kind of technological inventions and much more complicated questions about whose gametes there are and whether they're natural or not? And I think I'll stop there. I suppose a kind of concern that we need to look back and see if it is the case. This is a question, but if it is the case that marriage is the measure for whether a reproductive technology is a humane technology, if that is the measure, then if we lose a grip on that measure, then we won't be able to measure anything. We won't be able to measure even what we've got, and we certainly won't be able to measure the more difficult kind of technologies which are there in the future. And I think I'll stop there. My timing, is that right?
Yes, thank you, David.